19-year-old Brian Roberto Varela stood before Snohomish County Superior Court Judge Linda Crease in Linwood, Washington, on November 15, 2018, wearing a green and white striped prison uniform, his head bowed and his expression showing what appeared to be remorse as Judge Crease prepared to sentence him for the second-degree manslaughter, third-degree rape, and unlawful disposal of human remains of 18-year-old Alyssa Marie Noceda, a bright, beautiful high school student whom Brian had invited to a party at his mobile home near Martha Lake on February 3, 2018, given drugs that caused her to overdose and lose consciousness, and then, rather than calling 911 or seeking any medical help that might have saved her life, sexually assaulted her repeatedly over the course of hours while she lay dying or possibly already dead, took lewd photographs of her partially nude body, sent group text messages to his Dairy Queen co-workers showing the photos along with messages saying, "LOL, I think she odded, still breathing," and joking about the situation, went to sleep and then to work the next day while Alyssa's body lay in his bedroom, and finally stuffed her body into a large plastic storage container he stole from his mother's house before planning to bury her in a remote location. Before we continue with this deeply disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. For the 9 months between Alyssa's death in February 2018 and Brian's sentencing in November 2018, investigators, prosecutors, Alyssa's devastated family, and the shocked Linwood community tried to comprehend the shocking callousness and depravity Brian had displayed, not just in failing to help Alyssa when she overdosed, not just in sexually assaulting her as she died, but in the texts he sent to friends treating the entire situation as a joke, laughing about a young woman dying in his bedroom while he raped her unconscious body and planned how to dispose of her remains to avoid getting caught. The most damning evidence against Brian, the evidence that transformed this from a tragic overdose case into a shocking murder and rape prosecution that generated national outrage, were the text messages recovered from Brian's cell phone. Messages that showed Brian had sent photos of Alyssa's partially nude, unconscious or dead body to a group chat with his Dairy Queen co-workers, captioned with, "LOL, I think she odded, still breathing," followed by additional messages joking about the situation, admitting he was sexually assaulting Alyssa to pass the time, and expressing no concern whatsoever about the fact that an 18-year-old woman was dying in his bedroom while he raped her and joked about it with friends. When Deputy Prosecutor Colin Hayes stood before the courtroom during the plea hearing and sentencing, he presented these text messages to Judge Crease and to the packed gallery filled with Alyssa's family, friends, and community members who had come to see justice served. Hayes read aloud Brian's texts, the LOL message, the jokes about Alyssa overdosing, Brian's admission that he was sexually assaulting her to pass the time, his complete lack of concern for Alyssa's life, and the courtroom fell into stunned, horrified silence as the full depravity of Brian's actions became clear. Alyssa's mother, Gina Pearson, who had been desperately trying to reach her daughter by phone and text on the night Alyssa was dying in Brian's bedroom, broke down sobbing as she heard the prosecutor describe how Brian had ignored Alyssa's distress, how he had violated her body as she lost consciousness and died, how he had laughed about it with co-workers while Gina was frantically searching for her missing daughter. But what happened next shocked everyone in the courtroom and generated national outrage that would lead to changes in Washington state sentencing law. Despite the horrific nature of Brian's crimes, despite the fact that he had given Alyssa drugs that killed her, raped her as she died, sent mocking text messages joking about her death, and then hid her body and planned to bury her. Judge Crease announced that under Washington State's sentencing guidelines, she was legally bound to sentence Brian to only 2 years and 10 months in prison, barely 34 months, less than 3 years for causing Alyssa's death, raping her, and disposing of her body. Judge Creasy stated from the bench that she personally believed Brian deserved a much longer sentence, that his crimes were among the most disturbing she had encountered in her career, but that Washington's sentencing laws for defendants with no prior criminal record gave her no discretion to impose a harsher sentence, even though Brian's conduct was so egregious. The family's and prosecutors' hopes that Brian would serve decades in prison for his crimes were crushed by the revelation that he would serve less time than many people serve for non-violent property crimes, that he would be released while still in his early 20s, having paid an absurdly inadequate price for taking Alyssa's life and violating her body. Brian Roberto Varela was born on May 3, 1999, in Linwood, Washington, a suburban city of approximately 38,000 people located about 15 miles north of Seattle in Snohomish County. Brian grew up in what appeared to be a relatively normal working-class family environment. His mother worked to support the family. Brian attended local schools, and from outward appearances, there were no obvious red flags suggesting Brian would develop into someone capable of the depravity he would display in February 2018. Unlike many of the cases we've examined where the perpetrator had documented histories of violence, abuse, behavioral problems, or severe mental illness, Brian Varela's background was remarkably unremarkable. He had no prior criminal record, no documented history of violence toward others, no pattern of cruelty or concerning behavior that would have predicted what he was capable of. Brian attended school in the Edmonds School District, where he was described by teachers and peers as a quiet, somewhat socially awkward student who didn't stand out particularly in any direction, not as a troublemaker or behavioral problem, but also not as an outstanding student or leader. He had a small circle of friends and acquaintances, mostly people he worked with at Dairy Queen, where Brian had been employed for several months, leading up to February 2018. His Dairy Queen co-workers would later describe Brian as friendly enough, someone who showed up for his shifts and did his job, though they noted he could be immature and sometimes made inappropriate jokes or comments that suggested poor judgment about what was funny or acceptable. By early 2018, Brian was 19 years old, had graduated from high school or obtained his GED, and was living in a mobile home with relatives near Martha Lake, an unincorporated community in Snohomish County. He was working at Dairy Queen, apparently with no clear plans for his future, beyond the day-to-day existence of a working-class teenager in suburban Washington. He had some involvement with recreational drug use. Marijuana use was common among his peer group, and Brian occasionally used other drugs including pills and concentrated THC products. This casual drug use was typical for many teenagers and young adults in his social circle, not necessarily indicating serious addiction or dangerous behavior, but it did put Brian in social contexts where drugs were available and where sharing drugs with peers was normalized. Alyssa Marie Noceda was born on September 9, 1999, just 4 months after Brian Varela, making them both 18 years old in February 2018, when their paths would cross with fatal consequences. Alyssa was a senior at Henry M. Jackson High School in Mill Creek, Washington, a student who showed creativity and intelligence, but who, like many teenagers, struggled with some of the challenges and poor decisions common to adolescents. Alyssa had experienced some behavioral problems at school, had a history of occasionally running away from home when she was in conflict with her mother or frustrated with rules and restrictions, and had experimented with marijuana and alcohol the way many teenagers do, despite it being illegal and dangerous. But despite these typical teenage struggles, Alyssa was a beloved daughter, sister, friend, and classmate. Her mother, Gina Pearson, would later describe Alyssa as creative, artistic, someone with a beautiful smile and a kind heart, a young woman who was still growing and maturing, but who had so much potential and so much life ahead of her. Alyssa had friends who cared about her, family who loved her deeply, dreams of her future that included possibly attending art, school, or pursuing creative careers. She was still figuring out who she was and who she wanted to become, navigating the difficult transition from childhood to adulthood, making mistakes and learning from them the way all young people do. Alyssa and Brian knew each other casually through mutual friends and acquaintances in the Linwood area young adult social scene. They were not close friends, but they had met before, knew each other's names and faces, had probably socialized in group settings a few times. In early February 2018, Brian invited Alyssa and several other young people to come to a party at the mobile home where he was living near Martha Lake. For Alyssa, this was a typical teenage social opportunity, a chance to hang out with friends, meet people, have fun on a Saturday night. She told her mother she was going out with friends, and Gina Pearson, like most parents of 18-year-olds, had concerns, but also recognized that Alyssa was legally an adult who would make her own choices. Gina told Alyssa to be careful, to check in regularly, and to call if she needed anything. On the evening of Saturday, February 3rd, 2018, Alyssa arrived at Brian's mobile home where a small gathering was taking place. According to later statements from attendees, there were about 5 or 6 young people there, including Brian, Alyssa, and several others. The party was low-key, people hanging out, talking, listening to music, and using various substances including marijuana and alcohol. At some point during the evening, Alyssa went into Brian's bedroom with him, and what happened next would be documented through Brian's own later confession to police, through text messages he sent that night, and through physical evidence recovered from the scene. According to Brian's statement to police, given after his arrest when confronted with overwhelming evidence of his guilt, Alyssa asked if he had any drugs she could use, and Brian offered her what he claimed were Percocet pills, prescription opioid painkillers that produce euphoric effects when crushed and snorted, but which are also highly dangerous, especially when combined with other substances. Brian told police that Alyssa crushed and snorted some of the pills, and then Brian offered her a dab of concentrated THC, a highly potent marijuana concentrate that is vaporized and inhaled, producing much stronger effects than regular marijuana smoking. What Brian didn't tell Alyssa, or what he may not have known himself, was that the pills he gave her were not actually Percocet, but were counterfeit pills containing fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that is approximately 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, and which has been responsible for tens of thousands of overdose deaths in the United States in recent years, as it has infiltrated the illegal drug supply. Toxicology tests conducted on Alyssa's body after her death would reveal that she had lethal levels of fentanyl and alprazolam, the generics name for Xanax, a benzodiazepine, in her system, a deadly combination that causes respiratory depression, unconsciousness, and death. According to Brian's account, within approximately 1 minute of taking the THC dab, after having snorted the fentanyl-laced pills, Alyssa suddenly collapsed. Her eyes rolled back. she lost consciousness, and she fell onto Brian's bed, completely unresponsive. Brian told police he tried to wake her by slapping her face and calling her name, but she didn't respond. He checked for breathing and could tell she was still breathing, though her respiration was becoming shallow and irregular. Classic signs of opioid overdose that were clearly medical emergency requiring immediate 911 call and ambulance response. Any reasonable person in Brian's situation would have immediately called 911. Alyssa was overdosing in his bedroom, clearly in medical distress, at serious risk of dying without emergency medical intervention. Washington state has a Good Samaritan law specifically designed to encourage people to call for help in overdose situations. The law provides protection from prosecution for drug possession or use for people who call 911 to report an overdose. Recognizing that fear of legal consequences often prevents people from seeking help, and that saving lives is more important than prosecuting minor drug offenses. If Brian had called 911 immediately when Alyssa collapsed, paramedics would have arrived within minutes, administered Narcan, naloxone, to reverse the opioid overdose, transported Alyssa to a hospital, and almost certainly saved her life. But Brian didn't call 911. He didn't seek help. He didn't wake up the other people at the party to tell them there was a medical emergency. Instead, according to Brian's own confession and the text messages recovered from his phone, Brian looked at Alyssa lying unconscious on his bed and made a calculation. Calling for help would mean admitting he had given Alyssa drugs, would mean police would come to his house, would mean potential legal trouble for him. Rather than prioritizing Alyssa's life over his own convenience and fear of consequences, Brian decided to do nothing and hope Alyssa would recover on her own. But Brian didn't just do nothing. He did something far worse. With Alyssa lying unconscious and dying in his bed, unable to consent or resist or even know what was happening to her, Brian sexually assaulted her. According to his own admission to police and to the physical evidence recovered from the scene, Brian removed some of Alyssa's clothing and raped her while she was unconscious and possibly already dying or dead. The medical examiner would later testify that based on the timeline of the overdose and Alyssa's likely time of death, it was probable that Alyssa was either in the final stages of dying or had already died when Brian was assaulting her, meaning Brian had raped a dying or dead teenager rather than seeking help that might have saved her life. But even this horrific violation wasn't the extent of Brian's depravity. While Alyssa lay in his bed, unconscious or dead, Brian took out his cell phone and took photographs of her partially nude body. Then he did something that would prove to be the most damning evidence against him. Brian sent those photographs to a group text message with several of his Dairy Queen co-workers, along with messages that treated the entire situation as a joke. The text messages, which were later recovered by investigators from Brian's phone and from the phones of the recipients, told the story of Brian's callousness and complete disregard for human life. At approximately 11:47 p.m. on February 3, 2018, less than 2 hours after Alyssa had collapsed, Brian sent photographs of Alyssa's partially nude, unconscious body to the group chat, along with the message, "LOL, I think she OD'd, still breathing." One of the recipients, a co-worker, responded with shock, "Bro, you killed her." But rather than taking this comment as a wake-up call that he needed to seek help immediately, Brian continued joking. He sent additional messages saying things like, "But not joking, she odd bruh," and admitting that he was sexually assaulting Alyssa to pass the time, while waiting to see if she would recover. The text conversation continued with Brian making light of the situation, expressing concern not about Alyssa's life, but about whether he would get in trouble, asking his co-workers what he should do, but rejecting suggestions that he call 911. Throughout the evening and into the night of February 3rd, as Alyssa lay dying or dead in his bedroom, Brian's mother, Gina Pearson, was trying desperately to reach her daughter. Phone records would later show that Gina called and texted Alyssa multiple times. At 10:17 p.m., Gina sent Alyssa a text message asking, "Be careful. Do you know the person you're with very well?" The message, sent at almost exactly the time Alyssa was collapsing from the overdose, went unanswered. Gina continued calling and texting throughout the night, becoming increasingly worried as Alyssa didn't respond. Alyssa usually answered her mother's messages eventually, and the complete silence was unlike her. Brian saw Alyssa's phone lighting up with calls and messages from her worried mother, but he did nothing to respond or let Gina know that Alyssa was in medical distress. Instead, Brian went to sleep. After spending hours with Alyssa's unconscious or dead body in his bedroom, after sexually assaulting her and taking photos and texting with friends about the situation, Brian simply went to bed and fell asleep, leaving Alyssa lying next to him, her body growing cold as her mother frantically tried to reach her. When Brian woke up on the morning of Sunday, February 4th, 2018, Alyssa was clearly dead. Her body was cold. She had been dead for hours. There was no question that she was gone. But rather than calling police at that point to report the death and face the consequences of his actions, Brian decided to cover up what had happened. He had to work his shift at Dairy Queen that day, so Brian left Alyssa's dead body in his bedroom and went to work, spending his shift serving ice cream and fast food to customers, while Alyssa's corpse lay hidden in his mobile home, and her mother continued desperately searching for her missing daughter. During his shift at Dairy Queen, Brian's co-workers who had received the text the night before asked him what had happened with that girl. Brian told them she was fine, that she had woken up and left, that it was no big deal. He acted like nothing was wrong, joking and working his shift normally, giving no indication that there was a dead body waiting for him at home. When Brian returned home from work on Sunday evening, he began implementing his plan to dispose of Alyssa's body and avoid getting caught. According to his later confession, Brian cleaned Alyssa's body to try to remove DNA evidence, dressed her in some of her clothing, and then tried to fit her body into a large plastic storage container. Alyssa's body was too large to fit in the container, so Brian broke her leg, snapping the bone, in order to force her body into the container, a detail so grotesque and dehumanizing that it demonstrated just how little Brian valued Alyssa as a human being. Brian sealed the container with Alyssa's body inside and hid it in or near his mobile home, planning to transport it to a remote location and bury it where she would never be found. But Brian's plan to hide his crime was about to be derailed by the persistence of Alyssa's mother and the concern of one of Brian's co-workers who had received the disturbing text messages. Gina Pearson had reported Alyssa missing to police on Sunday, February 4th, after Alyssa had been unreachable for more than 24 hours. Gina told police that Alyssa had gone to a party on Saturday night and hadn't come home or responded to calls and messages, which was very unlike her. She provided police with what information she had about where Alyssa had gone and who she might have been with. As word spread on social media that Alyssa was missing and that police were searching for her, one of Brian's Dairy Queen co-workers, the one who had received Brian's "LOL, I think she OD'd" text the night before, became increasingly concerned. the co-worker contacted Brian's assistant manager and told her about the disturbing text messages and photos Brian had sent, explaining that Brian had joked about a girl overdosing and dying in his bedroom. The assistant manager immediately understood the seriousness of the situation and contacted police, providing them with information about the text messages and identifying Brian Varela as someone who might have information about the missing Alyssa Noceda. Detectives from the Linwood Police Department responded quickly, obtaining a search warrant for Brian's mobile home and his cell phone. On February 7th, 2018, 4 days after Alyssa's death, police executed the search warrant at Brian's mobile home. When they confronted Brian, he initially denied knowing anything about Alyssa's whereabouts, claiming she had been at a party at his house but had left, and he didn't know where she went. But detectives knew about the text messages, and when they searched Brian's bedroom, they found evidence that someone had recently died there. Blood evidence, drug paraphernalia, and other indicators of a medical emergency and death. Confronted with this evidence, Brian eventually admitted that Alyssa had overdosed in his bedroom and that her body was hidden in a plastic container. He led police to where he had hidden the container, and officers recovered Alyssa's body. The sight of Alyssa's remains, stuffed into a plastic container with her leg broken, hidden like garbage rather than treated with the dignity every human being deserves, devastated the investigators who had to process the scene and would later haunt them as among the most disturbing cases they had worked. Brian was arrested immediately and charged with controlled substance homicide for providing the drugs that caused Alyssa's death, first-degree manslaughter for causing death through extreme indifference to human life, second-degree rape for sexually assaulting Alyssa while she was incapacitated, and unlawful disposal of human remains. He was held on $500,000 bail, and the case proceeded through the legal system with significant media attention as details of Brian's text messages and behavior emerged. The recovery of Alyssa's body and the notification to her family was one of the worst moments of Gina Pearson's life. For 4 days, she had held out hope that Alyssa was alive somewhere, that there would be some explanation for her disappearance, that she would get her daughter back. But instead, police came to tell her that Alyssa was dead, that she had overdosed at a party, that the person she had been with had raped her as she died and then hidden her body instead of calling for help. The horror and grief of learning how Alyssa had died, how she had been violated and discarded, how Brian had laughed about it in text messages to friends. It was almost too much for Gina to bear. Investigators recovered Brian's cell phone and extracted all of the text messages, photos, and other evidence from it. The text messages became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, providing a window into Brian's mindset and demonstrating his complete lack of concern for Alyssa's life. The LOL I think she did still breathing message, along with the photos he had sent, and his subsequent messages joking about the situation and admitting to sexually assaulting Alyssa to pass the time, painted a portrait of someone who viewed another human being's death as entertainment, and who was more concerned with avoiding consequences than with preserving life. The case generated significant media coverage, with news outlets across the country reporting on the shocking details of how Brian had let Alyssa die, raped her, and joked about it in text messages. Public reaction was one of outrage and horror. Commenters on social media and news articles expressed disbelief that someone could be so callous, so depraved, so completely lacking in basic human empathy. The LOL text message became a symbol of Brian's moral bankruptcy. demonstrating that he found a dying teenager's suffering amusing rather than tragic. As the case proceeded toward trial, plea negotiations occurred between Brian's defense attorneys and the Snohomish County Prosecutor's Office. The evidence against Brian was overwhelming. His own confession, the text messages, the physical evidence from the scene, the testimony of witnesses who had seen Alyssa at Brian's house. Brian had virtually no defense to the charges, and his attorneys recognized that going to trial would likely result in conviction on all counts. In exchange for a guilty plea that would spare the victim's family the trauma of a trial and spare the state the expense of a lengthy prosecution, prosecutors agreed to reduce some of the charges. The controlled substance homicide charge was reduced to second-degree manslaughter. The first-degree manslaughter was dropped. The rape charge remained as third-degree rape, and the unlawful disposal of human remains charge remained. Brian agreed to plead guilty to these charges, admitting in court that he had given Alyssa drugs that caused her death, that he had sexually assaulted her while she was incapacitated and dying, and that he had hidden her body. The plea agreement set the stage for sentencing, and this is where the case took a turn that shocked everyone and generated national outrage. Under Washington State's sentencing guidelines, the standard range for second-degree manslaughter for a defendant with no prior criminal record is 21 to 27 months in prison. The standard range for third-degree rape is 6 to 12 months. The unlawful disposal of human remains charge carries a maximum sentence of 12 months. When these sentences are calculated to run consecutively, one after another rather than at the same time, the total maximum sentence Judge Kreese could impose was approximately 34 months, 2 years and 10 months in prison. This meant that regardless of how heinous Brian's conduct had been, regardless of the LOL text messages and the rape and the hiding of the body, regardless of the trauma to Alyssa's family and the community outrage, Judge Kreese was legally bound by Washington State sentencing guidelines to impose a sentence of no more than 34 months, unless the prosecution could prove aggravating factors that would justify an exceptional sentence. The prosecution did argue for an exceptional sentence based on the cruelty and callousness of Brian's actions, but Judge Kreese ultimately ruled that while Brian's conduct was morally reprehensible, it did not meet the legal standard for any exceptional sentence under Washington law. The sentencing hearing on November 15, 2018 was packed with Alyssa's family, friends, community members, and media. Alyssa's mother, Gina Pearson, and other family members delivered powerful victim impact statements describing Alyssa's life, the pain of her loss, and the additional trauma of knowing how she had died and how Brian had treated her body and her death. Gina spoke about Alyssa's creativity, her beautiful smile, her potential that would never be realized. She described the agony of the 4 days when Alyssa was missing, the hope that turned to horror when police told her Alyssa was dead. She described learning about the LOL text messages, about Brian raping Alyssa as she died, about him breaking Alyssa's leg to stuff her body in a container. "That was the last person my daughter saw," Gina said through tears, referring to Brian. "Just made me sick, made me feel sick." When it was Brian's turn to speak, he stood before the court and read a prepared statement expressing what sounded like remorse. "I made very foolish actions that led to a terrible tragedy," Brian said. "Whatever I receive is what I deserve. I'm truly sorry for my actions." But many observers noted that Brian's apology seemed rehearsed and lacking in genuine emotion, that he appeared more sorry for himself and the consequences he faced than genuinely remorseful about Alyssa's death. Deputy Prosecutor Colin Hayes addressed the court, presenting the text messages and other evidence showing Brian's callousness. Hayes read aloud Brian's LOL, "I think she OD'd," still-breathing message and other texts describing how Brian had treated Alyssa's death as a joke, how he had raped her as she died, how he had hidden her body and planned to bury her where she'd never be found. Hayes argued that Brian's conduct was so egregious that it warranted the maximum possible sentence and consideration of an exceptional sentence beyond the standard range. But then Judge Linda Crees delivered the sentence that would shock the courtroom and generate national outrage. 34 months in prison, 2 years and 10 months for killing Alyssa, raping her, and hiding her body. Judge Crees stated from the bench that she was bound by Washington state sentencing guidelines, that Brian's lack of prior criminal record meant she had no legal discretion to impose a longer sentence, and that while she personally found Brian's conduct reprehensible and believed he deserved much more time, the law constrained her ability to impose a harsher penalty. I am very troubled by the fact that Mr. Varela displayed such a callous disregard for human life, Judge Creasy said. The text messages, the LOL, the jokes about this young woman dying, it's deeply disturbing. But under Washington state sentencing guidelines, I am required to impose a sentence within the standard range, and I do not find that the aggravating factors presented meet the legal standard for an exceptional sentence. Therefore, I sentence Mr. Varela to 34 months in prison. The courtroom erupted. Alyssa's family members and friends cried out in anger and disbelief. "It's a joke," Gina Pearson shouted. "This sentence is a joke. He killed my daughter, he raped her, he joked about it, and he gets less than 3 years. Others in the gallery expressed similar outrage, calling the sentence obscenely lenient, a miscarriage of justice, an insult to Alyssa's memory. Judge Crees acknowledged the family's pain and expressed her own frustration with the limitations of the sentencing guidelines. "I understand the family's anger," the judge said. "If I had the discretion to impose a longer sentence, I would. But I am bound by law, and the legislature has determined the sentencing ranges for these offenses. If this sentence seems inadequate, that is an issue for the legislature to address by changing the law, not for this court to remedy by imposing an illegal sentence." Brian Varela was taken into custody to begin serving his 34-month sentence. With credit for time served and good behavior, he would likely serve approximately 28 to 30 months of actual incarceration, less than 2.5 years for killing Alyssa Noceda, raping her, and hiding her body. He would be released while still in his early 20s, free to build a life while Alyssa remained dead, buried in a cemetery where her family visits her grave and mourns what could have been. The public outrage over Brian Varela's lenient sentence sparked statewide attention and calls for reform of Washington's sentencing laws. News coverage of the case reached national outlets, including The Washington Post, USA Today, Fox News, and others, with commentators across the political spectrum agreeing that 34 months was grossly inadequate punishment for Brian's crimes. Social media lit up with outraged comments about the case, with people expressing disbelief that someone could kill and rape a teenager, joke about it in text messages, hide the body, and receive less than 3 years in prison. In response to public pressure and recognition that the sentencing guidelines for cases like Brian's were inadequate, Washington state legislators introduced bills to modify sentencing laws for cases involving controlled substance homicides and sexual assaults of incapacitated victims. The Alyssa's Law proposals sought to increase penalties for these offenses and give judges more discretion to impose longer sentences when defendants display extreme callousness or aggravating conduct. Some of these reforms were enacted in subsequent legislative sessions, though they came too late to affect Brian Varela's sentence. The case also sparked renewed attention to the fentanyl crisis and the dangers of counterfeit pills. Alyssa had believed she was taking Percocet, a pharmaceutical opioid that, while dangerous, has a known dosage and composition. But the pills Brian gave her were actually counterfeit pills, containing fentanyl, part of a nationwide epidemic of fake pills that look identical to legitimate pharmaceuticals, but contain lethal doses of fentanyl. Public health officials used Alyssa's case to warn young people about the extreme dangers of taking any pills not prescribed directly by a doctor and dispensed by a pharmacy, emphasizing that what looks like a legitimate pill might actually be a death sentence. The Washington Good Samaritan overdose law, which provides immunity from prosecution for drug offenses to people who call 911 to report an overdose, received renewed attention after Alyssa's death. Public health advocates emphasized that if Brian had called 911 immediately when Alyssa collapsed, he would not have been prosecuted for the drug possession or use, and Alyssa would almost certainly have survived. The law is specifically designed to prevent situations like Alyssa's death, recognizing that fear of legal consequences often prevents people from seeking help, and that saving lives is more important than prosecuting minor drug offenses. Brian's decision not to call for help, motivated by his fear of getting in trouble, cost Alyssa her life, and the case became an example used in drug education programs to encourage young people to always call for help in an overdose situation. As of December 2025, Brian Varela has been released from prison. He served his 34-month sentence with some reduction for good behavior and time served, and was released sometime around late 2020 or early 2021, having served approximately 2.5 years for causing Alyssa's death, raping her, and hiding her body. He is now in his mid-20s, free to live his life, while Alyssa Nacida remains dead at age 18, buried in Cypress Lawn Memorial Park, where her family visits her grave adorned with angel decorations and photos of Alyssa smiling, frozen forever at 18. Brian's release from prison generated renewed anger from Alyssa's family and from community members who felt he had not served nearly enough time. Gina Pearson told reporters that knowing Brian was free while Alyssa was dead was almost unbearable, that she feared he would reoffend, that she believed he had gotten away with murder. The conditions of Brian's release, presumably including probation, sex offender registration, and other supervision, were not widely publicized, but many observers expressed concern that someone who had displayed such extreme callousness and lack of empathy at age 19 was unlikely to be truly rehabilitated after just 30 months in prison. The question of whether Brian Varela feels genuine remorse for what he did to Alyssa Nacida remains open. His statement at sentencing expressed what sounded like remorse, but the LOL text messages and his behavior immediately after Alyssa's death showed someone who found her suffering amusing and who treated her body with contempt. Whether Brian's time in prison led to genuine reflection and development of empathy, or whether he simply learned to express what sounds like remorse in order to gain favorable treatment, is known only to Brian himself. What is certain is that Alyssa Marie Nacida deserved to live. She deserved to finish her senior year of high school, to graduate, to attend college or pursue art school, to build a career and family, to experience all the joys and sorrows and milestones and adventures that should have been ahead of her. She deserved to grow into her 20s, 30s and beyond, to develop her talents and interests, to love and be loved, to contribute to the world in whatever way she chose. Instead, her life ended at 18 in Brian Varela's bedroom, dying from an overdose while Brian raped her unconscious body and sent LOL text messages to his co-workers. The teen killer texted LOL after causing Alyssa's death And when the prosecutor showed the jury, and the judge, and the court, and the media, and the world those text messages from Brian's phone, everyone saw exactly what kind of person Brian Varela was. Someone who viewed another human being's death as a joke, who raped a dying teenager to pass the time, who hid her body like garbage and planned to bury her where she'd never be found. The text messages became the defining evidence of Brian's depravity, proving beyond any doubt that he had no regard for Alyssa's life or dignity. But unlike many of the cases we've covered where justice is served through harsh sentences that ensure the perpetrator spends decades or life in prison, Brian Varela's case ended with a sentence that shocked and outraged everyone who learned about it. 34 months in prison for killing someone, raping her, and hiding her body felt like no justice at all. It felt like Brian had essentially gotten away with murder, serving less time than many people serve for non-violent property crimes or drug offences. The case stands as a cautionary tale about gaps in sentencing laws, about the importance of calling for help in overdose emergencies, about the dangers of counterfeit fentanyl-laced pills, and about the callousness and depravity that some people are capable of showing toward others. Brian Varela's LOL text message will forever be associated with his name, a permanent record of his moral bankruptcy and his complete lack of basic human empathy. For Gina Pearson and Alyssa's family and friends, the pain of losing Alyssa continues every day. They visit her grave. They remember her life. They advocate for law changes that might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. They carry the additional burden of knowing exactly how Alyssa died, how she was violated and discarded, how Brian joked about her death while she lay dying in his bedroom. No amount of prison time could bring Alyssa back or fully heal those wounds, but the 34-month sentence felt like adding insult to injury, like the legal system had failed Alyssa, just as Brian Varela had failed her when he chose not to call 911. The teen killer texted LOL after murder, and the prosecutor showed the jury his phone, revealing Brian Varela to be exactly what he was: a person capable of watching an 18-year-old woman die, raping her as she died, joking about it with co-workers, and hiding her body. But unlike the satisfying justice we expect in such cases, Brian served barely 2 years and is now free, while Alyssa Naseda remains forever 18, buried in a cemetery, her potential unfulfilled and her family forever grieving the daughter, sister, and friend they lost to Brian's callousness and the legal system's inadequate response.